From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We need to open the promise of America to every American. And that means we need to make the issue of racial equity not just an issue for any one department of government. It has to be the business of the whole of government.
President Biden issues 4 executive orders to promote racial equity, from phasing out private federal prisons to combating housing discrimination. We'll speak to Ashley Woodard Henderson of the Highlander Center in Tennessee. Then we go to Varshini Prakash of the Sunrise Movement on Biden's plans to combat the climate crisis. Should he declare a national climate emergency? Plus, where have all the vaccines gone? Of the 41 million doses handed out in the United States, only about half have been administered. This comes as states report running out of COVID vaccines.
The confusion around this issue, which we acknowledge there is some confusion, speaks to a larger problem, which is what we're inheriting from the prior administration, which is much worse than we could have imagined.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The world has recorded over 100 million cases of COVID-19. Global deaths now top 2.1 million. In the U.S., January is already the deadliest month since the start of the pandemic, with at least 80,000 lives lost. President Biden took new steps Tuesday to ramp up the rollout of vaccines, including the purchase of 200 million more doses. Half will come from Moderna, the other half from Pfizer-BioNTech. Weekly vaccine supplies to states and tribes will also be increased. Officials from the Biden administration walked back the president's statement earlier this week that any American who wanted the shot could get it by the spring, instead saying end of summer is a more likely timeline. This is Biden speaking Tuesday.
The brutal truth is it's going to take months before we can get the majority of Americans vaccinated. Months. In the next few months, masks, not vaccines, are the best defense against COVID-19.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says schools can safely reopen with precautions in place, such as mask wearing and social distancing. The CDC says local authorities would also need to impose more stringent restrictions elsewhere in the community, including indoor dining, to keep overall infection rates down. In international news, Britain's topped 100,000 coronavirus deaths, the world's 5th highest death toll. Prime Minister Boris Johnson addressed the nation to mark the grim milestone.
I am deeply sorry for every life that has been lost, and of course, as Prime Minister, I take full responsibility for everything that the government has done.
Several European countries, including Germany, are making medical-grade masks mandatory in some indoor public spaces. France is also recommending medical masks over fabric ones. In the Netherlands, nightly riots have shaken towns and cities across the country following a curfew imposed Saturday to stem a new wave of infections. Police arrested nearly 200 people Monday night. Local authorities have expanded police authority to counter the riots. Canadian officials fined a casino mogul and his wife after they flew to a remote community in the Yukon Territory in order to cut the line for vaccines. Rodney and Ekaterina Baker received coronavirus vaccines intended for Indigenous residents in Beaver Creek, including elders of the White River First Nation, after the couple claimed to be staffers at a local motel. Back in Washington, D.C., all but 5 Senate Republicans backed an effort to dismiss Donald Trump's impeachment trial Tuesday, voting in favor of an objection raised by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, who argued the trial's unconstitutional since the goal of impeachment is to remove someone from office, he claimed. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell also backed Rand Paul's move, despite accusing Trump on the Senate floor of provoking the insurrection. Although the trial will still go ahead, Tuesday's vote could indicate it will end in Trump's acquittal. Meanwhile, Senate President pro tem Patrick Leahy, the Vermont Democrat, was briefly hospitalized after feeling unwell Tuesday, hours after he was sworn in to preside over Trump's impeachment trial. President Biden signed 4 executive orders Tuesday aimed at addressing racial inequities. One order directs the Justice Department to end its use of private prisons. As a senator, Biden authored the 1994 crime bill, which intensified mass incarceration, disproportionately targeting black and brown communities. But he expressed regret for his past policies on the campaign trail after intense scrutiny and pressure. Immigrant rights advocates are calling on Biden to also end the use of private immigration jails. Another executive order directs the Department of Housing and Urban Development to, quote, redress racially discriminatory federal housing policies, unquote. 2 other orders commit to respecting and reinforcing tribal sovereignty and combating xenophobia against Asian Americans. We'll have more on Biden's orders after headlines with Ashley Woodard Henderson, head of the Highlander Research and Education Center in Tennessee. President Biden's also placing racial justice at the center of his plan to combat the climate crisis. He's announcing major actions today, including a moratorium on new oil and gas leasing on public lands, moves to cut carbon emissions, and move the country away from dependence on fossil fuels, and investing federal funds in communities of color and other groups most vulnerable to pollution and the effects of the changing climate. We'll have more on Biden's climate plan with Sunrise Movement's Varshini Prakash. In immigration news, a federal judge in Texas has temporarily blocked the Biden administration's 100-day moratorium on most deportations. U.S. District Judge Drew Tipton ruled to suspend the policy for at least 2 weeks while a challenge by Republican Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is reviewed. Paxton's suit argues the moratorium violates immigration law and a legal agreement between Texas and the Trump administration. Judge Tipton was appointed by Trump last year. The Justice Department has so far charged over 150 people and identified another 400 as suspects in the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. At least 19 suspected rioters have been tied to far-right groups, including the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, a far-right gun group, Texas Freedom Force, and the conspiracy group QAnon. On Tuesday, top U.S. Capitol security officials issued an apology for failings before and during the deadly Trump-incited assault as they appeared before the House Appropriations Committee, which is investigating the attack. Acting U.S. Capitol Police Chief Yogananda Pittman said, quote, by January 4th, the department knew that the January 6th event would not be like any of the previous protests held in 2020. She went on, we knew that militia groups and white supremacist organizations would be attending. We also knew that some of these participants were intending to bring firearms and other weapons to the event. We knew that there was a strong potential for violence and that Congress was the target, she said. Pittman became the acting chief of the Capitol Police after her predecessor, Stephen Sund, resigned following the riot. She's the first African-American and first woman to assume the role. This comes as the commander of the D.C. National Guard says the Pentagon restricted his authority before the riot, delaying the deployment of troops after the Capitol Police chief called asking for help. CNN reports Georgia Republican Congressmember Marjorie Taylor Greene, an open supporter of QAnon, repeatedly indicated support for violence against Democrats and intelligence agents on Facebook in 2018 and 19 before she ran for Congress. In 2019, she liked a comment that said, quote, a bullet to the head would be quicker to remove House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. In related news, calls are mounting from gun violence prevention groups for Greene to resign over posts from 2018 where she promoted harmful conspiracy theories that the school shootings in Sandy Hook, Connecticut and Parkland, Florida were staged. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Josh Hawley, who backed Trump's efforts to overturn the election, defended militia members in an article he wrote as a 15-year-old in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is urging global action against the spread of neo-Nazism and white supremacy, which he says has proliferated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Guterres spoke at the UN Holocaust Remembrance Service. Today marks the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Anti-Semitism continues to blight our world. It is sad, but not surprising, that the COVID-19 pandemic has triggered yet another eruption of this poisonous ideology. We can never let down our guard.
The U.S. Senate confirmed Tony Blinken as Secretary of State Tuesday in a 78-22 vote. Blinken has said he'll prioritize multilateralism and suggested during his confirmation hearing the U.S. is open to re-entering the Iran nuclear deal. He's also promised a tougher stance against Russia and the continuation of a hardline approach on China and Venezuela. In other news from the State Department, a spokesperson said it's reviewing the designation of Yemen's Houthi rebels by the Trump administration as a terrorist group. On Monday, the Treasury Department said it was authorizing financial transactions with the Houthis for the next month after aid groups and the UN warned the move would cut off Yemenis from much-needed aid and essential transactions. Richard Mills, the acting U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, said the Biden administration will restore diplomatic relations with the Palestinian Authority and resume aid to Palestinians that was cut off during the Trump presidency. Mills also said the U.S. would continue to support a two-state solution, though many progressive regional experts oppose the strategy, saying it's no longer viable. In related news, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas announced earlier this month parliamentary and presidential elections will be held this year, the first elections in the occupied territories in 15 years. Analysts say the move is an overture to the new Biden administration. In other news from the region, Israeli forces shot dead another Palestinian teenager, 17-year-old Talarayan, at a military post near a Jewish settlement in the occupied West Bank. Israelis accuse the teen of trying to attack the soldiers. A political crisis in Italy is deepening after Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte resigned Tuesday following weeks of government turmoil. The resignation followed a dispute among the governing coalition over Conte's handling of the pandemic and over European Union coronavirus recovery funds. Conte is expected to try to remain as leader by forming a new coalition, but if those efforts fail, Italy could be headed towards snap elections amidst a devastating second wave of the pandemic. And Mexican authorities have launched an investigation after 19 bodies were found shot and burned over the weekend in a town near the U.S.-Mexico border. Relatives of asylum seekers from Guatemala say they believe 13 of the dead could be their loved ones and includes teenagers who were trying to reach the United States. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by my co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
After winning office with massive support from people of color, President Joe Biden moved Tuesday to advance what the White House calls his racial equity agenda.
Open the promise of America to every American. And that means we need to make the issue of racial equity not just an issue for any one department of government. It has to be the business of the whole of government.
Biden opened his speech by invoking the legacy of George Floyd, the African-American man whose death under the knee of a white Minneapolis police officer prompted nationwide protests against racism. He announced 4 executive actions.
Today, I'm directing the Department of Housing and Urban Affairs and Urban Development to redress historical racism in federal housing policies. Today, I'm directing the federal agency to reinvigorate the consultation process with Indian tribes. Respect for tribal sovereignty will be a cornerstone of our engaging with Native American communities. Today, I'm directing federal agencies to combat resurgence of xenophobia, particularly against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that we've seen skyrocket during this pandemic. I've also asked the Department of Health and Human Services to put out best practices for combating xenophobia in our national response to COVID. I'm rescinding the previous administration's harmful ban on diversity and sensitivity training and abolish the offensive counterfactual 1776 Commission. Unity and healing must begin with understanding and truth, not ignorance and lies.
Many civil rights groups welcome Biden's executive orders. Alicia Garza of Black to the Future Action Fund called the orders, quote, a floor to set and not the ceiling. As a Senator, Biden authored the 1994 crime bill, which intensified mass incarceration, disproportionately targeting Black and brown communities. But he expressed regret for his past policies on the campaign trail after intense scrutiny and pressure. On Tuesday, Biden also ordered the Justice Department to halt its use of private prisons run by the Department of Justice.
The executive order directs the Attorney General to decline to renew contracts with privately operated criminal facilities, a step we started to take at the end of the Obama administration and was reversed under the previous administration. This is the first step to stop corporations from profiting off of incarceration that is less humane and less safe, as the studies show. And it is just the beginning of my administration's plan to address systemic problems in our criminal justice system.
The order will impact about 9% of the federal prison population. President Biden made no mention of ending contracts with privately run immigrant prisons that jail the majority of people for immigration and customs enforcement. Some criminal justice activists argue private prisons increase incarceration rates, but leading prison abolition scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes focusing on private prisons is how, quote, the new realists achieve their dominance by defining the problem as narrowly as possible in order to produce solutions that on closer examination will change little, she said. Biden's push to advance a racial equity agenda comes as COVID has devastated communities of color. It'll be led by Domestic Policy Council Director Susan Rice, the former UN ambassador and Obama-era national security advisor. She also spoke Tuesday.
Americans of color are being infected by and dying from COVID-19 at higher rates. 1 in 10 Black Americans and 1 in 11 Latino workers are currently unemployed. By some estimates, 40% of Black-owned businesses have been forced to close for good during the COVID crisis. Black and Latino families with children are twice as likely to be experiencing food insecurity during the pandemic as white families. And Black and Latino Americans are 2.8 times more likely to die of COVID-19.
All of this comes as the Biden administration's vow to treat white supremacist violence as a national security threat. For more, we're joined by Ashley Woodard Henderson, co-executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center, which has long pursued a racial equity agenda. It was founded in 1932 to provide education and support to poor and working people fighting economic injustice, poverty, prejudice, and environmental destruction. Many civil rights activists passed through Highlander's grounds, including Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Stokely Carmichael. In 2019, one of the Highlander Center's buildings was destroyed in a fire that was investigated as a possible arson and hate crime after a white power symbol was found spray-painted in the center's parking lot. The symbol's frequently used by white power groups and was painted on one of the guns used by the mosque shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand, a month earlier. Ashley Woodard Henderson is also an organizer with the Movement for Black Lives and the Frontline. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Ashley. If you can start off by responding to this racial equity agenda that President Biden has put forth in the midst of this investigation into the worst white supremacist violence at the Capitol now?
Absolutely, and thanks for welcoming me back, Amy and Juan. It's good to see you all. So I think, as my sister Alicia Garza said, that this is a step forward. It's a progressive step, and we're grateful. But I want to start before the executive orders and talk a little bit about how we got here. Because although Joe Biden is using executive power to make this next shift, to take this step towards racial equity, he's not just doing it because he's a good person. He's doing it because everyday people, like many of the folks that are watching this show, got into the streets and have been making demands for generations now around racial equity. His even being in the position of President of the United States is due to the fact that those of us who are a part of the largest social movement in U.S. history not only put our feet to the pavement, but also put our feet to the pavement to make sure that we could win the presidential election and get rid of Trumpism up and down the ballot. And so this is not just because of his good graces. This is because movement made it possible that racial equity be something that is prioritized in the executive branch of our government. So, these executive orders are a step in the right direction, but they absolutely do not fully meet the demands of our movement. It is just a floor, not a ceiling. The brutality and racism of prisons in this country are clearly recorded. Right. And just getting rid of this one piece of the prison industrial complex is not going to stop the brutality and the militarization of our communities. It's absolutely time for us to stop this sort of punishment bureaucracy that's been encouraged by our government. And it's just tearing our families and our communities apart. So this is a step towards that. But as our comrades in the immigration movement, as our folks that are fighting against police brutality in prisons and militarized forces of all stripes, we know this is just a step in that direction. The housing executive order, critical, right? It's definitely an important step. But this country is experiencing unprecedented housing crisis, right? Where Black women in particular are most likely to lose their homes during stay-at-home orders across the nation, right? We know that according to the data, that Black women are twice as likely to be behind in their rent as white people because of the economic conditions that they've inherited in this country and have historically faced evictions at twice the rate of white people in at least 17 states in our country. A nationwide eviction moratorium was necessary. This executive order is necessary. But what's real is we need to see cancellation of rent across this country, right? We need to see the cancellation of student debt. We need to see defunding policing, whether that's federal police, Capitol Police, whether that's, ICE and Border Patrol, right? We're talking about all of it. We're demanding what we deserve, not just what we would concede to. And so we're excited to see these first steps. Sure, it's something to celebrate because movement made that possible. It's a people's victory. But we also need to continue to put pressure, political pressure, on the powers that be, both in the executive branch, but also in the new Congress and the legislative branch, to say that we deserve even more, right? And we need even more from them. We expect them to be champions of our demands because there's so much more to do. We need to pass the Breathe Act, right? We need to pass the Thrive Agenda. We need to pass the Green New Deal and see a real transformed country that changes the material conditions of our people because we put them in office to do that.
Well, Ashley, I wanted to ask you, in terms of an aspect of the president's executive orders, is this a requirement that every federal agency produce within 100 days a report on what their particular agency can do to advance equity, racial equity across the country? I'm thinking this especially in terms of the issue of systemic change, if that's possible, and under a Biden administration, and many people question that. But in terms of systemic change, I'm thinking of agencies like the Agriculture Department, the Energy Department, the Small Business Administration, even the Securities and Exchange Commission, agencies that normally don't get much attention in terms of racial equity. Now they're going to have to examine and produce a report within 100 days of what can be done to advance it. Do you see the potential for the movement to begin putting pressure on these agencies in terms of the kinds of reports they're going to produce?
Absolutely. But I think we also need to be real that a report does not immediately promise equity, right? The equity is a doing thing. And that just creating space for more access and for more conversation does not necessarily mean that we will get the kind of equity that we've been demanding, right? It's who is representing our people in those conversations. What are they demanding of those departments, and how is that translating from reports into direct policy changes? And I think that the hesitancy that a lot of people in social movements across this country and across the world really have, is that we don't just want to investigate and ask questions, though that is a critical part of the process of getting to equity. We also want to see like actual policy change, and not only that policy change, but we want to see people in elected and appointed positions in our government be held accountable to actually implementation of the recommendations that come from those bodies and those reports, right? If we don't see a level of accountability to the actual implementation of policy change, then we will have more information about the disproportionate impact of discrimination and systemic oppression in this country through different departments and different issue areas in our communities, but we won't see the transformation of those conditions. And I think that is the great hesitancy, which is why, again, it's really critically important that our movements not lean back and take away pressure and assuming that we can just take a break and accept that this new administration is in and that they'll save us. We were not voting to elect saviors. We were voting to control our conditions and to elect our next target, to push for the most transformational change that we could get. And I think that that's going to be our responsibility, to pay attention to what comes out of these reports, but also to push them to take the next step of actually actualizing what transformative policy could be in practice.
And the issue of the president saying that the Justice Department should cease using private facilities for criminal detainees, but not necessarily for civil detainees, which would include most of those on immigration charges. Your sense of what can be done to increase the pressure on the president to end the private use of detention facilities for immigration purposes?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's why we need a multiracial, multi-sector, working class rooted united front that really came together to fight to get the 45th president of the United States out of office and usher in this new administration. It's even more important for us to continue to put pressure across our issue areas around this. You know, I think people think about immigration reform as just like a single sector, a single siloed issue, when actually it's connected to the fight for racial justice. It's connected to the fight for economic and worker justice. It's connected to this fight for all of our people to have collective liberation. And so I think we need to be following the leadership of folks like Grayson Martinez Rosas and United We Dream and Mi Gente and so many other incredible immigrant rights organizations. We Dream in Black, you know, I think about all of the incredible UndocuBlack, all the incredible immigrant justice organizing that's happening, Women Watch Africa, and so many others that are actually at the forefront of this front line for immigration justice, and to recognize that when we're talking about the crisis of the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, when we're talking about policing and militarization, and when we're talking about immigrant justice, that these fights are intimately linked. They are definitely connected, and that we will all be in this fight demanding all of these things together, right? That we are building a movement big enough not to be piecemealed, and that until all of us are free, none of us are free. And so we'll be fighting to make sure that when we talk about, when the Movement for Black Lives talks about defunding police, that we're talking about all police, including ICE, and Customs and Border Patrol. When we talk about abolishing prisons, that we're talking about all of them, including detention centers. And when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, we're talking about all Black lives, including those of our people that are in this country without papers.
Ashley, we're talking to you in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In 2019, one of Highlander Center's buildings was destroyed in a fire. Authorities investigated the incident as a possible arson and hate crime after a white power symbol was found spray painted in the parking lot. The symbol frequently used by white power groups, painted on one of the guns used by the mosque shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand, a month earlier. And I was wondering if you can talk about how that was dealt with. And what you're seeing right now in Washington, D.C., with the Republicans who so decried the Black Lives Matter protests, with the hundreds of Black Lives Matter activists that were arrested. Nowhere near that number has been arrested for the January 6th attack on the Capitol, the Confederate flag brought into the Capitol, the ransacking of offices. If you can talk about both.
Yeah, I think this is a really important and critical question, Amy, so thank you for it. I think the first thought that I had on January 6th was, well, I wish that folks had listened to us. Because again, this arson at the Highlander Center happened in 2019 before we were in the throes of the electoral cycle, right? This was, at a time where Black churches all across the South are being set on fire by white supremacists, right? It wasn't an attack that happened in isolation. This is when, mosques and synagogues are being attacked by white supremacist nationalist and paramilitary forces. This was not an isolated issue, right? We had been screaming to the rafters that we were the canary in the coal mine, that white supremacist violence was increasing, that we were seeing organizations building power, related to white supremacy and white nationalism, and not even just in the South, right? I think of our colleagues at the Western State Center and Political Research Associates and colleagues in the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest who have been saying that white people that felt isolated, folks that were proponents of right-wing populism, were looking for places of belonging, and they were creating them, or they were joining organizations like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, right? We've been saying this for a very long time. And so when, Charlottesville happens, and then the attack on Highlander happens, and then, the bombing in Nashville happens on Christmas Day, it felt like an escalation was happening. Right, that we could see on social media clear as day that folks were planning to go to this protest in D.C. on the 6th. That we could be seeing that the federal government and folks that are literally paid to do a job to pay attention to harm that is happening in our country were not at the helm to ensure that it didn't happen. Was quite frustrating. I think to compare what happened on January 6th to what happened to us in March of 2019. We haven't heard any updates about that investigation or gotten any more questions about what happened to us from the investigative bodies since August of 2019. So my expectations for a thorough investigation of this are only optimistic because of the power of our movements to demand it. Right? If we just leave it to the powers that be to do the right thing, I fear that similarly to the Highlander investigation, that this will just tarry on and on and on with no conclusion. And I think it's critical that the demands of the front line really be executed, right? That Donald Trump actually see his day in front of the Senate, right? And that they finish the impeachment process. I think it's going to be critical that we demand the investigation and the expulsion of each member of Congress who fanned the flames of white and male supremacist violence and voted against the certification of the election results. And even more, that we transform this country by investing in our communities, in healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities, and investing in the planet, as opposed to institutions and policies that harm our people and our planet.
Ashley Woodard-Henderson, we want to thank you so much for being with us, co-executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center, organizer with the Movement for Black Lives and the Front Line, speaking to us from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Next up, today is Climate Day at the White House. A number of executive orders are being signed. We'll speak to Varshini Prakash of the Sunrise Movement. Stay with us.
Oh, they tell me of a place where there is no more crying, and they tell me in this place there won't be no more dying. They tell me that the blind will see, and you tell me that the lame will walk. They tell me that the deaf will be able to hear, Lord, and the dumb will be able to talk. Somebody tell me, how do I get there?
How do I get there? By by Don Bryant. This is democracynow.org. Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Today is Climate Day at the White House. President Biden is signing new executive orders to suspend new oil and gas leasing on federal property, reestablish a White House Council of Science Advisors, and set a goal to protect 30% of federal land and water by 2030. Biden's also signing initiatives to prioritize environmental justice by creating a White House Interagency Council on Environmental Justice and directing federal agencies to invest more in communities of color heavily impacted by pollution and the climate crisis. This all comes a week after Biden used his inaugural address to declare the climate crisis to be one of the core issues facing the nation.
This is a time of testing. We face an attack on our democracy and on truth. A raging virus, growing inequity, the sting of systemic racism, a climate in crisis, America's role in the world. Any one of these would be enough to challenge us in profound ways. But the fact is, we face them all at once, presenting this nation with one of the gravest responsibilities we've had. Now we're going to be tested. Are we going to step up?
On his first day in office, President Biden signed executive orders to have the United States rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. He also canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, put a moratorium on oil and gas permits in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and ordered a review of Trump's actions undermining public health and the environment. Biden's new climate envoy, John Kerry, says every agency in the government will be tasked with addressing the climate crisis.
And it is our firm conviction throughout all of our administration, every agency is now part of our climate team. And only together are we going to be able to build the resilience to climate change that is critical to save lives and meet our moral obligation to future generations and to those currently living in very difficult circumstances.
On Tuesday, newly sworn-in Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen wrote a letter to Treasury employees saying, quote, "I believe economic policy can be a potent tool to improve society. We can and should use it to address inequality, racism, and climate change." To talk more about the Biden agenda and the response to the climate crisis, we're joined by Varshini Prakash, co-founder and executive director of the Sunrise Movement, also the co-author of the new anthology, The New Possible, Visions of Our World Beyond Crisis. Varshini, you've already leading a movement pressuring the Biden-Harris administration from the first day, from before. I mean, hundreds of Sunrise Movement members were arrested 2 years ago, more than have been arrested at the Capitol now for the insurrection, demanding a Green New Deal. Do you think these executive orders meet that threshold?
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on again. And you know, I'd say I think Joe Biden is off to a good start. I think a number of the executive orders that he has put into motion and that he has been the narrative that he has been sharing over the last week has been in line with his campaign promises. He has, stopping the Keystone XL pipeline, and I believe he should go further and stop the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, which has both, were sites of great indigenous resistance. I think, the plan of creating a civilian climate corps, which would essentially employ young people and people in disadvantaged communities to do the critical work of stopping the climate crisis, is something that Sunrise and many other organizations championed for and pushed for. So I think this is a great start. And what I would say is the issue of the climate crisis is such that in large part, most of what Biden has done is set into motion the policies and programs that would need to reverse the damage that has been done over the last 4 years of Trump being in office. But the truth is, we created Sunrise in the aftermath of the Obama administration when we perceived a climate in crisis and that we were hurtling towards catastrophe. And so I think this is just the beginning. We're going to need to see a lot more from Joe Biden at the executive level and directing every branch of the federal government to action. But we're also going to need to see him working actively to organize his congressional colleagues to pass what we need to be the greatest sort of green jobs and infrastructure recovery plan that this country has seen, to reboot this country, to invest in environmental and climate justice, to bring racial equity to this country. And unless he is able to deliver on his, Build Back Better plan that myself and AOC and others contributed to, and that he ran on in large part because the movement pressured him to, I don't think we're going to be nearly as close to combating the climate crisis as we need to be.
And Varshney, what is the significance of the president elevating the climate crisis to a national security priority? And what about the issue of him outright declaring a climate emergency, as many other countries around the world have done, and as even Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer recently urged him to explore? Right.
Well, I mean, we are in an emergency. We are under threat. We are at a life-changing, civilization-altering moment in humanity's history. And we have faced grave existential threats before as a nation, whether it was combating the Great Depression, whether it was World War II, whatever it was, we have risen to those moments. But it has taken both organized people and organized politicians and power working in concert to make it happen. And so I think for the president to convey to the nation that this is a serious threat, even though, we are seeing rising disasters, and even though we are seeing a rising movement, a number of Americans still don't perceive the climate crisis to be a top threat in the United States, and to have the president declare that we are in a climate emergency, I think would say a lot. And it also opens him up to being able to use greater executive authority with the risk that Congress cannot pass the level of policy that we ultimately need. But I don't think that negates the need to pressure Congress. And in particular, I think we've got to focus on a couple things. One, I think Joe Biden needs to champion his issue, the issue of climate crisis and his Build Back Better plan in the American public, and not sort of behind in closed-door conversations with Republican obstructionists like Mitch McConnell or Democratic ones like Joe Manchin. I think this is a time for him to bring the vision of his Build Back Better plan, of a Green New Deal, of a recovery agenda that promotes racial and economic justice to the American people, and build popular support around it, and challenge these obstructionists to stand in the way of tens of millions of good, high-paying, unionized jobs, of guaranteeing every American in this country the right to clean air and clean water. So I think that's step one. And I think step two is, ensuring that he's also championing the ability to get rid of some of these things like the filibuster, which has essentially allowed for minority rule in this country and completely impeded America's capacity to govern and legislate and pass the policies that a majority of Americans, and frankly, frequently a majority of senators, have also supported. So, we need democracy reform. We need to ensure that the Americans who support a pro-climate agenda have the ability to elect representatives that represent their views and their positions on these issues. And those are all part and parcel. They're not separate from the issue of addressing the climate crisis, because in essence, we will need to pass dozens of pieces of policy over the decades to come to combat this huge, huge issue.
And what's your concern in terms of the current makeup of Congress? I'm thinking specifically of Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who is clearly has voiced repeatedly his opposition to lots of attempts to go away from fossil fuels. And he obviously, in an almost evenly divided Senate, has extraordinary power now. What do you think are the hopes for the movement to be able to pressure the Senate on these issues?
Yeah, I mean, we have to go for broke in this moment. I think now is the time to pressure Democrats and Republicans alike, also senators who are up for re-election in 2022. I think we need to be in the streets to the extent that that is safe and possible. We need to be making calls to these congresspeople. We need to be writing op-eds and letters to the editor. The only reason that Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer are prioritizing climate in this moment is because the movement made them do so. And, 2 or 3 years ago, the climate crisis and climate justice was thought of as a political loser. Nobody wanted to touch it with an 100-foot pole, and it was sort of like a shameful secret to tuck climate policy into the corners of various other policies. That isn't true anymore, and it's because we agitated and we organized and we bird-dogged these politicians every place that they were, and that I'm seeing a lot of people seeing in this moment attempting to make actually the same mistake that we made when Obama got into office of saying, we've got a Democrat back in, now we can sit back. And that is a huge danger. So we've got to keep up the pressure on people like Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, and a number of others. And, in addition to that, I think it's time for Joe Biden to show that he, to cash in on the relationships that he claims to have made over the last decades in office, and to bring the caucus fully along, because ultimately, if we can abolish the filibuster, we can pass a lot of policy with just a simple majority.
So the comparisons, Varshini, between how you all have been dealt with these peaceful protests you've had at the Capitol, hundreds of you were arrested in 2018, to what happened at the Capitol now. Interestingly, the first African-American chief of Capitol Police did admit she's now the head of it because the one who was there during the insurrection, Chief Zund, had to resign. They knew that this protest on January 6th would be nothing like what they'd seen in the past, that people had guns, that they were white supremacists. They understood that they would be violent. And yet it's peaceful protesters like you who are the ones who've gotten arrested in the Capitol.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't. It was just incredible to also be reminded of the uprisings from last summer and the images, just frankly, traumatic images I saw of women being beat or groped in the streets or being arrested, or members of my own movement and organization who were trapped on bridges in New York. Hundreds of people trapped on bridges and tear gassed. I'm not saying that people deserve that kind of treatment. I think what I'm saying is, there was clearly a double standard in this seriousness. And I think that what we've got to be prepared for as a movement is to understand that white supremacy, that nationalism, that rising fascism, that hate and division existed long, long before Donald Trump and will continue to exist after Donald Trump. We cannot make the mistake of believing that white supremacy is bookended by the Trump administration. And I'm seeing a lot of people with that sort of false hope. And so I think as we know, we've just come off of Martin Luther King Day. The only thing that can contest with rising escalated violence is rising, escalated, peaceful, loving nonviolence and community action. And so I think we've got to join with our movements, the Movement for Black Lives, immigrant justice movements against gun violence, et cetera, alongside the climate movement to put a stop to it.
We just have 30 seconds, but Biden has issued an executive order against the Keystone XL pipeline, but not against the Dakota Access Pipeline. It was one of those epic struggles that took place to shut it down, led by the Standing Rock Sioux. They are demanding that it be shut down now. Your thoughts?
I mean, he has to. He absolutely has to, and there's precedent for doing so. Obama stopped it. And, I mean, it was an unparalleled global indigenous resistance. The water protectors, I mean, it was one of the most incredible, inspiring things that I have ever seen in my life. And I'd also put in that category pipelines like the Line 3 pipeline, which has been facing enormous indigenous and rural resistance in Minnesota.
Varshini Prakashi, thank you so much for being with us, co-founder, executive director of the Sunrise Movement. When we come back, where have all the vaccines gone? Stay with us.
Pas coincé dans son crédit quand moi indépendant. C'est depuis longtemps, pas bien cassé ma boule. Vous sentez pas quand t'as l'esprit, tout c'est continué. Des années de sacrifier toute sa gain à tout non. Chaque coup t'aimes passer pour ça, me sentir la caillame. Ma chronique, t'as quoi ici, c'est pour colonie. Moi, quoi, nous sommes naturels, pas dans vanité. Sous tes années, toutes ces mêmes, nous partageons de quoi ça. Univers, ça c'est pour nous, moi, tout, pas une nouvelle là. Concentrez-vous de dénoncer tout ça qui veut opprimer. Résistance, c'est force, par quoi, n'importe, les noms, tout son. Nous m'a dit qu'à renverser.
I came here to leave you a message, and if you don't catch it, your eardrum might just self-destruct. Test your luck, and if you won't, we take full responsibility. Not bragging about
Any Sound by Nomadic Massive. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. January has become the deadliest month of the pandemic so far, with at least 80,000 deaths in the United States, and the month is not over. The United States has about a fifth of the deaths and infections in the world. On Tuesday, President Biden announced plans to acquire another 200 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines with a goal of vaccinating most people in the country by summer. But the Biden White House is facing a crisis after the Trump administration left no plan for distributing vaccines. In addition, millions of vaccine dosages have apparently gone missing. The Daily Beast reports about 41 million doses have been handed out to states, but less than 22 million have been administered. This is based on data from the Centers for Disease Control. Meanwhile, many states report running out of vaccines. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki addressed the issue Tuesday.
Our team is working right now. We've been here for 5 days to evaluate the supply so that we can release the maximum amount while also ensuring that everyone can get the second dose on the FDA recommended schedule. So the confusion around this issue, which we acknowledge there is some confusion, speaks to a larger problem, which is what we're inheriting from the prior administration, which is much worse than we could have imagined. So we are assessing now what we have access to and ensuring that we have more of a rapid engagement with states so that they have more of a heads up on what to expect in the weeks ahead.
We're joined now by Daily Beast reporter Erin Banco. Her latest piece is headlined, "Millions of Vaccine Doses Are MIA, and Feds Aren't Sure Why." Erin, this is an astounding story. It's not that the U.S. doesn't have enough vaccines. We're talking about 20 million vaccines. You have in New York City the canceling of appointments by various hospitals and other places because they just don't have the vaccines, and that's just one city in this country. Where have all the vaccines gone?
Hi there. Thanks for having me. Yeah, this is an incredible moment that we're in right now. The Biden team has been working really overtime over the last several days to try to figure out why states are reporting shortages while also reporting that their vaccination rates are quite low. So the CDC's federal vaccine tracker, says that about 40 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine have been distributed to states, but as you pointed out, only about 20 million of those doses have been administered. That's a huge gap. Now, some of that gap might be attributed to states holding second dose reserves, doses that are being allocated or earmarked for the federal long-term care facility vaccination program. But apart from those sort of anecdotes of reserve holding and the long-term care facility program, states are telling federal officials that they believe millions of doses are sort of lost in the distribution system, whether they be in warehouses or refrigerators at main distribution hubs. And so what the Biden team is trying to do now is sort of do an accounting exercise to figure out where these vaccine doses are located, whether they're still good, whether they're expired, or whether they can be put in people's arms, and how to get them to where they need to be going. Now, states are saying we have shortages. We've talked to a couple of state officials over the past few days who say the demand for the vaccine spiked in recent weeks. They've scheduled, tens of thousands of appointments, and they just simply do not have enough supply to fill that demand. But the federal government's problem is, well, you still have vaccine doses out there, according to our data. So where are these doses?
And Aaron, what about the potential for an already existing black market? Because I've become increasingly convinced that this is going to become one of the biggest scandals of this entire pandemic, is the distribution of these vaccines, because clearly there is a market for these vaccines out there, and people who are wealthy enough or who have the connections can potentially feed a black market in them. Are there any indications that that's already been happened? There's clearly indications that with those who have received the vaccines, because I know of personal examples of people who have exaggerated their underlying conditions in order to get into the front of the line, situations of abusing the essential worker designation in order to get to the front of the line. But of the missing vaccines, do you see any indications of siphoning off of supplies illegally?
I do not have any anecdotal or concrete evidence that these vaccines are being, quote unquote, stolen, or that there's a black market that exists. But I think you're right. I think we've been hearing, I personally have been hearing a lot of stories about residents in New York who are calling into Jersey City vaccination centers, saying, inflating their comorbidity status and getting in across state lines to get vaccines. Other, instances out west where wealthy hospital donors are jumping the line to get the vaccine. But I think what all of this tells us is that a couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration, in line with the Biden team, transition team, decided to widen the pool of who could qualify to get this vaccine. Part of the fear internally within the Trump administration was that the vaccine rates were super low, and they were afraid of the slow uptake. So as a way to remedy that, they decided to widen the pool of who could sign up and get the vaccine. Now, that almost sort of worked too well, because we're at a point now where demand is super high in a lot of states. And states simply just don't have the infrastructure, the staff, or the ability to administer those doses quickly. And they're also saying we have shortages. So I think the black market issue is less apparent right now. I think what's really happening on a state level is basic accounting problems for where these vaccines have gone, and why. The question is, why can't we get these into people's arms more quickly? It's a supply chain issue, and there are sort of different problems at every step of the supply chain, and those problems look different from state to state. So for the federal government, the question is, how do we get our hands around this problem, and how do we come up with a national plan that encapsulates all these different anecdotal issues that we're hearing about across the country?
And what about this tracking system that the federal government has? I mean, in a world where Google knows exactly where every individual is based on their smartphone and their GPS, what is the tracking system that the federal government is using? Is it relying on the states to once the doses are delivered to let them know what's happened, or is it continuing to track the vaccine shipments?
I think this is one of the biggest stories right now, and sort of an underreported issue, is the lack of concrete, reliable, comprehensive data at the federal government level. So the way that the federal government tracks the vaccine distribution, they rely on a slew of different streams of data, including state data.
Erin, we have 20 seconds.
Data from Tiberius, which is the Pentagon tracking system. But there are lags in reporting, and the data that they're looking at is just not reliable enough to understand what the issue is. And so that's what they're working on now. How do we get better data so we can diagnose the issue?
Erin Vanko, I want to thank you so much for being with us, and we will link to your piece. Millions of vaccine doses are MIA. Feds aren't sure why. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Wear a mask. Stay safe.